Natalia Molina is a distinguished professor and Dean's Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She is the Vice President and President-elect of the Organization of American Historians, the largest scholarly organization focused on U.S. history with over 6,000 members. Her influential research examines the interconnected histories of race, place, gender, culture, and citizenship. An award-winning author, teacher, and mentor, she has written 3 acclaimed books: How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts; Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles from 1879 to 1940, and most recently, A Place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community. The Los Angeles Times called A Place at the Nayarit an essential Los Angeles book. It was a finalist for a James Beard Award and received 14 awards and honorable mentions from various organizations. The book chronicles the lives of immigrant workers, including Melina's grandmother, who became placemakers, nurturing and feeding their communities at restaurants that served as urban anchors. Professor Molina is currently working on a new book, Hidden Histories of the Huntington Library, Immigrant Labor and the Making of Los Angeles. Recognized as a USC 2023 Communicator of the Year, she has written for the LA Times, Washington Post, San Diego Union Tribune, and elsewhere. In 2020, she was named a MacArthur Fellow. For today's event, she'll be talking with Sue Tyson, the head of the California History section here at the State Library. Please welcome Sue and Natalia. Thank you.
Thanks, Devorah. All right, so Natalia, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. I wanted to start off just with a basic introductory question. Your book tells many stories of the life of your grandmother, Doña Natalia Barraza, who immigrated to the United States in 1921 and founded the Nayarit restaurant in 1951, like we had mentioned. It also tells of the lives of the many immigrants who worked there, of the key role of urban anchors, such as the Nayarit, in providing a place for community life to unfold. So, for those who haven't read the book yet, can you tell people a bit about the book and what motivated you to write it?
Yes, absolutely. At first, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to speak with you all. I've actually been in your actual physical space. I had a tour when I was on the board of California Humanities, 5-year state librarian. And so I really appreciate being brought into the fold of this history. So I had been teaching already for about 12, 14 years. I just finished my second book and I was asked to give a talk on any aspect of California history. And since I just finished my second book, I was like, what am I going to write about? And I'd always wanted to tell the story of the Nayarit. The Nayarit of my grandmother of Echo Park, because after teaching for over a decade, I hadn't really seen a story quite like it. I taught in urban studies, and so a lot of the works on cities and ethnic communities were about segregated barrios. A lot of the work in Chicano history focused on men, on social movements like the Chicano movement. If they were on rural spaces, maybe farm workers and immigrants in that way, if they were on urban spaces, more about movements. But I hadn't really seen something that focused on women as community leaders, as women, I can talk about in a little bit, as placemakers, as the really vital role of unofficial institutions, what I call urban anchors in the book, like restaurants. So it was a way of getting at kind of the cultural landscape of immigration that even myself was not finding in the archive. The archive gave the records of, the voices that were looking at the immigrant community, like city council leaders, lawmakers, immigration officials. And even when they were from the community, it was more from like union leaders and privileging the voices of men and people who were in leadership positions, although, as we know, women were doing a lot of that work as well. So to me, it was a way to really get at these untold stories, these hidden histories.
Fascinating. And as an archivist, I we hear you. So we do know, and traditionally archives, especially in the 19th century, it was all about documenting, the powerful, and over the decades that has changed.
Mhm.
But so much does escape. And so it's really a wonderful take on history that you're providing with this. Can you give us a sense of the Nayarit itself? So what did they serve? What were their hours? Who worked there? Who ate there? What's the significance of the name Nayarit? And maybe can you tell us a bit about Doña Natalia herself?
Sure, let me show you a picture of the Nayarit. So here we see the book cover. Um, and this was the other thing. I gave the talk at this conference that I said I was invited to give the keynote, and this is a space that didn't have any archives, right? So I did some oral interviews. I looked up as many newspaper articles as I could, but it was
Mhm.
really tough. And I had this really brilliant colleague at the time, Professor Luis Alvarez, who'd written about the Zoot Suit riots and Latino communities in mid 20th century LA. And he said, "How is a restaurant different than a club?" And I was like, "Oh," so I always tease him. That's a question that like I wanted to close the chapter on writing this book, and it kind of opened it up because
Same.
apropos to your question, Sue, the restaurant, unlike a club, was a meeting space for people. It was open from, early in the morning till 4 in the morning. And so you had people that would go and have breakfast there on their way to work. You had, white collar office workers come at lunch from the downtown area, and you had people come before and after an event, as well as have dinner there. As many people told me, it was the place to be seen. It was the place you went to before an event and after an event. And so it kind of had something for everybody. As I've been told, as I've given talks on the books, of course, not everybody could even afford to go to a restaurant.
Mhm.
But even that, the Nayarit had something for them, as people might on a Sunday go and get takeout. They'd bring their pot, and my
So
grandmother
cool.
would make these large batches of Mexican soup, like menudo, which is a very kind of uh, homey dish that one would have on a Sunday. And people would come and get a takeout with their pot of menudo and a stack of her homemade tortillas, so that the housemaker of the family didn't have to cook that day. And so at its core were core clientele were working class Mexicans. And it was the place that they felt that they could really be seen, right? This is the mid 20th century. They're living very segregated lives in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of the kind of labor that they're doing. And yet here they could go and be seen. And the cover on the photo of on the book here is of my grandmother, my mother, and other people, employees and customers alike, who are there on a celebration night. And so the restaurant, was catering to a white American clientele. You could see the wording in English here, but
Mhm, mhm.
also there are signals like the Nayarit, which is the state of Mexico that my grandmother's from, and authentic Mexican food that she really wanted to communicate. So she was really trying to serve both clienteles. Um, my grandmother was a formidable presence. I never met her. She had passed before I was born. I like to joke that I don't think I would have been born if she hadn't passed, because I don't think she would have allowed my mother to date my father. But she was, I mean, the fact that she immigrated at the age of 21 years by
Mhm,
herself, on the wake of the Mexican Revolution, to a place
mhm,
that she didn't know anybody, that alone tells you a lot about her. And I've gotten questions over the years like, you don't write about her in this warm, fuzzy way. And I always wonder, if I was writing about my grandfather, would I get that question?
mhm,
She
mhm.
was a
Certainly.
really great example of, think of what's sacred in your life and draw a circle around that, and don't do other things. The restaurant was sacred to her, in terms of communicating her culture, her food. but also as a way of immigrating her family and her friends, because she could write an immigration visa letter for people, and people could immigrate
Amazing.
legally, which meant they could get a foothold by working at the restaurant, but then they could leave if they wanted. They weren't beholden
Mhm.
to her. And so the restaurant was, this kind of cultural hub, but also a really important economic hub and placeholder for people that were first immigrating to the US.
How brilliant, really. And I have to say that sounds like my dream restaurant. Like just I mean, it just sounds like such a really truly vibrant urban place, right? Where you don't know what you'll see and who you'll meet and but you also do, right? So and your book's title prominently features the word place. And in its chapters, you delve into the key concepts of place and place making. So how did I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but how did the Nayarit play a central role as a community space, as an urban anchor? And how did your grandmother foster a sense of community and belonging among its workers and its customers? I mean, she really did bring people together, and it sounds so very intentional. And as a related question, as a historian, what does a focus on place bring out that a focus on events might not?
That is a great question. I will say that, this was also my second or third book. And oh, here we go. This was also my third book. So I had a sense of, I didn't want to only tell the story of the Nayarit. I
Mhm,
wanted to tell the story of I wanted to tell the story in a way that other people could then use the concepts, because
mhm,
I knew that just like I had a restaurant like the Nayarit, a lot of people have a restaurant like the Nayarit
mhm,
in their hometown. African
mhm,
American history literature showed us the importance of barbershops and beauty
mhm,
salons and juke joints.
mhm,
Other people, might go to a cafe. And so, what I really wanted to make clear is that there's something very special about that immigrant generation that comes in and builds a space for the community by the community. And so I
mhm,
call them placemakers.
mhm,
I also, and part of that placemaking activity was being a space that felt safe. And, we
mhm,
are understanding that oh so importantly now, right? This is the mid 20th century where people might not have been able to venture into public space
mhm,
because of segregation, because of how much they worked. This was a place that people were likely to bump into their fellow countrymen, people who spoke Spanish.
mhm,
On Sundays, when families would go to the restaurant, one of the things that people told me in their interviews was that you would you would see people make the sign of the cross before they ate. So, also displaying their religion. So really having kind of this place where they didn't have fear. And that's why I call these places urban anchors. We often think about places like a church or a school as an anchor. These were a lot of adults that were immigrating. They wanted a place that they could find community readily. Libraries are also such an important
yeah.
urban anchor, right? But we sometimes overlook the ways that restaurants can have that social function, create that
Mhm,
cultural glue for people. And so it was the ways in which customers found this community with one another, but the workers as well. One of the things that motivated me to write the book was that people worked there for decades. And I write about in the book that one of the things that motivated me to write the book was that after my uncle passed in the 90s, so, the restaurant closed in 76. So a good, 15, 16 years after the restaurant had closed, that after he passed, we sat around saying the rosary, the novena where you say it for 9 days in a row. And I looked around and everybody in that room, especially as the crowd dwindles, as you're towards the end of the novena, had worked or at the restaurant or a family members of theirs had worked. Just like a
That's
hometown
amazing.
association creates community, so do
Hmm.
shared urban anchors.
Fascinating. No, that's really telling. That is more than a workplace, right? Um, so many workplaces you are glad to, see the door close. Um, and as you note in the book, many of the Nayarit staff were gay. Can you talk about the restaurant's significance as an inclusive space for women, for immigrants, and for LGBTQ people, especially given the context of its times?
I think that was another really interesting thing about the restaurant that I felt was different than what I've seen in the literature, what I was experiencing.
Hmm.
The restaurant was, and I'll actually jump ahead a little bit and answer a question you didn't ask, which is because it's related. So the restaurant was located on Sunset Boulevard, so also
Hmm.
just readily accessible. People could find it, and there we go. Was readily accessible in Echo Park. But Echo Park was not just a Latino neighborhood, right? It
Hmm.
was this very diverse area.
Hmm.
It ends up becoming um, it ends up becoming one of the home of one of the first gay societies in the U.S., the Mattachine Society. And so you have a lot of working class whites there. You have a small Latino population at the time. You have a small Asian population in terms of Filipinos. A lot of immigrant groups that you would consider white today, but then were very ethnically distinct: Hungarian, Italian, Irish, English. And so people were really trying to kind of find this common ground along with an LGBTQ community. And
Hmm.
so when my grandmother starts a restaurant, she had already started a restaurant closer to downtown, also off of Sunset Boulevard. And that owner that she was leasing the restaurant from said, we're going to have to, I'm going to sell the restaurant when your lease ends, so you'll have to find another place. She could have easily gone 2 miles east into East Los Angeles and been
Hmm.
around a community that one would think was more like herself, pretty more homogeneously Latino, more Spanish speakers. Instead, she chose to go 2 miles west. And since I never met her, I couldn't ask her, but I have to wonder how much was that about this was an area where there was more freedom in terms of social norms, in terms of
Hmm.
diversity, in terms of sexuality, because she was not living a normative life existence, right? She's a single woman. Um,
Hmm.
by then, she's now adopted 2 children. She's married, but really it's more of a paper marriage so that she could adopt the 2 children.
Interesting.
And, she, as a single mother, is also, probably looked upon sometimes, askance. So she helps immigrate single moms. She
Hmm.
helps immigrate her gay nephew. He helps immigrate his friends. And so the Nayarit has a workforce not typically seen in other Mexican restaurants. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that it then became a gay urban anchor.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
again, I didn't get to interview her about this. So as a historian, what I have to do is I have to look at the context and I have to
Hmm.
look at what might have influenced her views, because she was very explicit about it's okay to be gay, but don't bring that identity to work. So that could have
Interesting.
been her own kind of internalized homophobia, that even though she was
Hmm.
hiring these workers, or it could have also been the laws at the time. The
Hmm.
laws at the time could have easily made it so they could have shut down her restaurant if it had
Hmm.
operated as an openly gay space.
Hmm.
So, as historians, we don't always get the answers, but we know what questions to ask by looking at the sources and by looking at the historical context.
Really, really interesting. Um, Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I know, I mean, I lived in Echo Park when I first moved to LA, which was in 2006, and I lived there for 12 years. And we lived actually off in an area that was off of the sewage system. Like it was so it was it was an area where people said, "Oh yeah, there used to be a circus, like it was like a small circus down the street, and there were illustrators and Walt Disney people, you know." So it's a fascinating area still, of course, but and as you noted in the book, and you have a few slides to this effect too, um, public space is not synonymous with democratic space. Um, can you talk about this context of undemocratic space at the time, redlining, racial covenants, all of those, you know, things in LA, and how Echo Park did and did not fit into that, as Doña Natalia was running the Nayarit?
Sure. Yeah, that was, I was really fascinated by, we had this sense of, well, it's a restaurant, so maybe that's a less democratic space. Uh,
Hmm.
these are the kinds of things that were seen on restaurants in other places,
Hmm.
right? The signs, this one's from Dallas, Texas. No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. It's the kind of sign that you would find in a public pool. The public
Hmm.
pool where
Hmm.
Mexicans could not go on a regular basis in some places, including in Los Angeles County, that they were
Hmm.
only allowed in the day before the pool was drained because they believed that they would dirty the pool as dirty Mexicans. Parks that were segregated, beaches that were segregated. There are beaches, photos, historical photos of beaches where there's a rope on the beach that extends into the water. Um, Even after fighting in World War II, Latinos faced discrimination. They couldn't be buried in any cemetery that they chose.
Hmm.
So, there was so much segregation going on that it was important, at schools. This is Westminster, a photo of a school, Mendez versus Westminster, a Mexican school. And so, this is a case that predates, you know, um, uh, Brown versus the Board of Education. And so that importance of having a place where people felt that they could come, be themselves, claim space, and belong was so important, even if
Hmm.
it was Los Angeles, California, a place that we think of as not having segregation like they did in the Jim Crow South.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and just to extend that, so beyond placemaking, you also describe very compellingly the movement of the communities, I should say, towards place taking, venturing forth, as you put it, into the city and asserting one's rights to it. Can you talk about this a bit, including Doña Natalia's, role in encouraging place taking?
I just was so fascinated that if you look at the kind of strict archival record,
Hmm.
you're going to get that kind of segregation, right? Like that map that I just showed you. If
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
look at that map, you're like, oh, there's not a way that people are sharing space. This is a redlining map. It shows the red areas are the areas that are most segregated and therefore seen as dangerous, right? So it also came with this moral stigma. How does one kind of traverse this landscape? We know that they're not going to be very well accepted in these green spaces. But that's what
Hmm.
was fascinating is if you look at work, and to go to your earlier question, versus an event or something, a place like a workplace, all of a sudden now you can start seeing the way that people traverse landscapes. So my grandmother's restaurant was the Nayarit, and then workers who work there might then some of them establish their own restaurants. One of them was Barragan's, and the owner, Ramon Barragan, recently passed in June. And the LA Times wrote a beautiful, Gustavo Arellano at the LA Times wrote a beautiful piece about him, explaining that significance of Mexican restaurants at this time. So, they opened other restaurants in Echo Park. They opened a mom and pop grocery store, El Bate.
Mhm.
They opened restaurants going into Hollywood. And they opened one a little bit later, El Conquistador, that ended up becoming that gay urban anchor that my grandmother's restaurant was not. But now this is the 70s. It's,
Right.
post Stonewall, or in LA, post Black Cat. And so they're able to now become place takers in a different way. My grandmother also realized it wasn't just economics that was going to get you ahead, it was cultural capital. And so
Mhm.
she also wanted to encourage people, the workers at the restaurant, to go out. And that was facilitated by the fact that they met people at the restaurant. Oh, you work at the Ambassador? Oh, maybe I can go visit you. Sure, make sure you come on a Wednesday because that's when my boss isn't there and I can get you a free cocktail. Oh, you work at Dodger Stadium? I work at the Stadium Club. Oh, I've never been there. Okay, come on this day, but come early and you can stay for a beer before it gets crowded, right? So they
That's
were
awesome.
able to facilitate this access to cultural capital, which anybody who has a family member that works in the service industry knows that, I'm the daughter of a bartender. So I know that, you're able to learn things, have access to spaces you wouldn't otherwise. And so
Mhm.
by working at the restaurant, they also learn to go to other places to become place takers.
Very cool. That's awesome. And I love how Natalia seemed like she seems like someone who really had a mission. Like you don't have to be warm to have a mission and to have a huge effect on people. That just really came through in the book. That she really cared and really thought it through. Um,
And she was a bit of an introvert herself. She was always back of the house. My mother, Maria, was front of house. And so to me, I think of it like, when we think about when you think of the typical immigrant American dream that people come here and they want their kids to have something better for themselves, we usually think about it as like an economic dream. But
mhm,
for her, it was clear it was a cultural dream because she really encouraged them to go out. And she even designated one night a month where they should go out and try a new restaurant or, go dancing or go hear some music. But they had to be back before midnight because that's when they got another rush as other people were leaving those spaces. So that cultural capital was really important as well.
That is super interesting. And you had a slide too of you with Jaime Haren. Am I saying
Yes,
it correctly?
yes, absolutely. Jaime
And I
Hari,
wanted to ask you what that was about there and
as I
who he
mentioned,
was
yes, as I mentioned
or
before,
is. I'm sorry.
the Nayarit, its core clientele were ethnic Mexicans, working class ethnic Mexicans. But it was also a place that celebrities went, both Latino and non-Latino. Why? Because even though people had an economic advantage, even though they might have cultural capital as a baseball player, Echo Park, Dodger Stadium sits in Echo Park's backyard. As a
Hmm.
celebrity, it didn't mean that one, they spoke English or that they spoke English without an accent. It
Hmm.
didn't mean that they might not be discriminated against based on how they looked, especially for the Latino ball players that came through town, because at this point, the Dodgers in the 60s didn't have very many Latino players. The Latino players that came through town on other people's teams were often Cuban, they were from the Dominican Republic. So they were speaking Spanish and they had dark skin and might pass as African American, which meant they could be doubly discriminated against. Jaime Harin was one of these people that came to the restaurant, and in his case, he was fluent in English. And yet, he found the Nayarit was that place where he could come and bump into people that he knew or that would also speak Spanish. And so, when I spoke to him, he talked about, the Nayarit was a historic place in Los Angeles. Who doesn't speak of it? Here's this,
Hmm.
Spanish language broadcaster for the LA Dodgers, now a National Baseball Hall of Famer, and yet still speaks about this space with love and affection because he experienced that discrimination firsthand when he went to other cities to announce the games. they had the Spanish language announcers, out in a separate booth, inferior booth, sometimes couldn't stay at the same places as the players. The players often stayed at different places depending on their nationality, their skin color. And
Hmm.
so, it really drove home the importance of having a place where people felt they could belong.
Fascinating. Well, I have one last question before we open it up to the audience. But so we've been talking a little bit about how archives fail to capture much, right? And that much of community life moves through the community moves through life in ways that aren't captured by archives. And one example that struck me was you talked about we might know of homeowners associations because of, say, meeting minutes or something like that. But what we don't know often is the sense of community that allowed those homeowners associations to even come to be, for example. And I also read in an interview of yours that uh, you're really invested in public scholarship, writing op-eds, teaching to K to 12, talking about looking at history and community. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, the role of the public scholar, public scholarship, and ways to bring out hidden community history.
Thank you. That's a great question. I also just wrote down what you said. The community moves through life in a way that the archives don't capture. I love that. I'm gonna have that little quote with me soon. You're gonna see yourself quoted in one of my newsletters.
Sure.
I love that. Um, one thing that gets me is that when you tell somebody that you're a historian, they tend to have two reactions, right? Uh one, if they, well, I guess three. One is like, oh, I hated history in high school.
Yes.
Or I love history. I love the History Channel, and
Hmm.
World War II, and it's like kind of a war kind of idea of history, a version of history dominated by wars. And for me, I was never neither. For me, that latter version is not why I'm interested in history. I'm interested in history because history is storytelling.
Hmm.
And history lets you understand what structured people's possibilities, what foreclosed them, why we know some people's stories and not other people's stories. It's called history, but it's really just a way of sharing people's stories and understanding that this isn't all shaped by like an individual choice, that there are structural components, laws, economics, politics that shape those choices. The third thing that I get about history is people will say like, now's a good time to be studying immigration history. I've been hearing that my entire career.
Hmm.
We're an immigrant nation. There's always a good time to be understanding immigration history. And if anything, if we
Hmm.
understood it better, then maybe we wouldn't keep repeating it.
Hmm.
So I had the honor and privilege on Sunday of receiving an award for one of my articles, and it was on mass deportations, and I published it in the LA Times in November after our Homeland czar had announced that we will probably be deporting families or deporting people. And the interviewer was on 60 Minutes said, but at that point he said that we would only be deporting criminals. And the interviewer on 60 Minutes said, what if they're part of a family? And are you going to
Hmm.
separate families? And he answered, they can just deport along with them. Families can remain together.
Yeah.
So I sat, this is in November, and I sat down and wrote a op-ed about it. And that's usually the way my op-eds come out. Like whatever I'm angry about, I just
Hmm.
at least write like one quick version of it. And at the time, this was seen as something really unbelievable, but there was so much historical precedent for it.
Hmm.
And so to me, writing those op-eds, writing public-facing essays is about showing people this moment is not made just in this moment. It has
Hmm.
a long historical arc, a long, what I often call racial scripts. these moments that were captured before through laws, through our cultural understandings of immigrant groups that keep resurfacing. So the better we understand that history, the better chance we have of dismantling it. And so, I did that during COVID with the ways that we look at how medical racism shapes ideas about immigrant communities. I do that a lot with immigration. And so, it's a way also of getting people to get interested in these topics. People, I've been very fortunate. This book, A Place at the Nayarit, has been well received because people love to talk about food. People love to talk about joy. People like to see, these stories of women that we haven't heard before. These are not unlike the immigrant communities today. And so hopefully people will read a book like this and make connections with immigrant communities today to see that, they're just people, many of them, wanting to come here for a better life. But the immigration laws have changed, and it's harder and harder to immigrate in a as documented folks. There's great books out there like by Ana Mignan on being undocumented, by Jason De Leon on immigrants from El Salvador and what they face. So, understanding that the people that are coming today don't have, in no way have the same opportunities that my grandmother did. And a lot of that is because of the way that the laws have changed, the access to visas have changed.
So important. Well, on that note and on that question and on that precipice, let's just say, let's open it up to any questions that might have come in from the audience.
Great.
Yeah, it looks like we have a few coming in, so I will start with the first. Joshua asks, were there any spoken or unspoken rules of social behavior while eating at the Nayarit?
And I see the next one is, was there entertainment and music?
Yes. Was there entertainment and music?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put those together. So one is, I think I've mentioned some of those kind of norms, which is while there was gay employees, one of the social norms was still not to really speak about that identity publicly. But, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, people started off their night at the Nayarit. They might have a drink, then go to a club, then come back. So did the gay workers' friends and family. Their families came on Sundays. So there was a way in which it was still that kind of urban anchor. And yes, there ended up being entertainment in part because, I think of my grandmother like that book, The Giving Tree, where she was trying to help people advance on what they were interested in. And so my uncle, who was one of the first people she helped immigrate, he was a piano player. And so she wanted to help advance him in his career. He was a waiter, and he would play at other bars in LA sometimes. And so she ended up getting an entertainment license so that he could he could play at the restaurant. And what my mother says is that getting an entertainment license was more difficult than getting a liquor license. So again, you're under so much scrutiny as a restaurant, as somewhere that had that served alcohol and then entertainment. And so she really was kind of cognizant of that. There was some form of surveillance in a sense of the restaurant. But that was one of the other things that drew in celebrities, that drew in other musicians. And my friend and colleague, Anthony Macias, has a beautiful book on the music scene, the Latino music scene in LA at this time. I believe it's called Mexican Mojo. And looking at not just the big performers, but the smaller performers and clubs in that area. Where Mexicans and Mexican Americans really had a really vibrant social life.
Thank you. Our next question is, I think, a lovely reminder of just the impact of your work. She writes, Natalia, thank you so much for this beautiful book. I'm an assistant principal and have been in education for 15 years. Your book came in a timely manner to remind me what community and community work can and should look like. I am also from Nayarit, so this was a particularly special book for me. Have you been to Nayarit? If so, what was that experience like?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your comments. I will also say for for everyone out there, I have a newsletter. So if you like being part of these conversations, you can put your email in the chat, or you can go to my website, nataliamolinahd.com, and sign up for my newsletter, because I try to include resources for educators a lot. On the books website, on the press website, like halfway down there, different tabs. And I have curriculum for the book as well, because like I said, I'm really interested in people telling their own stories and giving them the tools to do that. I grew up in California, so I have a son. I remember, and I work with K through 12 educators. I remember that fourth grade curriculum, and it's still a lot of times told from the top down. And I would love a California history where you saw a class kind of put together all their urban anchors and talk about California, and talk about their city, their community, as people use the space, not just as it's planned by urban developers. I have been to Nayarit, and that was the other reason I wrote the book. And the last chapter looks at those connections between Los Angeles and Nayarit, how it's maintained through hometown associations. So the other motivation to write the book was, I talked a little bit about how we usually study Latino communities in urban studies, but I had seen in a lot of the immigration literature, we usually looked at it through, other kinds of anchors like hometown associations. But what I saw in my research was that before you could get a hometown association, you needed to get people together. You needed to know who was there. You needed to have people talking, and you needed someone to organize. And those were often the women. In this case, I write about in the book, my Aunt Vicky Tabarez, who would call everybody when the editor of the hometown newspaper would come through town. And it was through all these informal gatherings at the restaurant, the Nayarit, at other restaurants, at picnics, where who made the food? Women, of course, that they were able to really get a sense of what community was there. I was also interested because, Nayarit, there's such pride if you're from Nayarit. I think every Mexican home state. It was such regional pride. So my grandmother names the restaurant the Nayarit. This is a time when people name the restaurants things like El Sarape, El Cholo. There was no sense of like the specificity of that Mexican identity, but Nayarit is referring to the specific state. It's an indigenous word. It's a Huichol word. So she's also not trying to hide her indigenous identity. Or Mexicans' indigenous identity. This is really political. This is a time, we're just shortly before you could be barred from getting US citizenship, from naturalizing, if you were seen as indigenous. And so there were a lot of things that she was able to do with that restaurant as a space by serving her food. She was serving dishes like pescado zarandeado that you see on the beaches of Nayarit, that it's not until, decades later that the James Beard Foundation awards Connie Seafood a restaurant for serving this kind of dish, that she was hand making her tortillas, that she was making salsa so hot that they wrote about it in the newspaper saying, "Oh, be careful, you better apply that with an eye drop," right? Alongside also saying, we serve lunch and dinner, and we have a taco enchilada plate, right? Combo plate for those that want something more familiar. So it was her really trying to show this is what it means to be Mexican, and we have pride around it. We're not trying to whitewash this.
That's great.
Somewhat related, one of our attendees asks, did your grandmother advertise her business, or did people find it only by word of mouth?
This was another great, everybody's asking the best questions. Thank you. So this was this gets at something that was a breakthrough in the book for me. So as I said, this is a restaurant. It didn't leave an archive. This is a community that didn't really have a big archive, and Echo Park itself was somewhat overlooked because it was seen as one of these racially mixed areas. And so in the homeowners loan corporation evaluation system, it wasn't seen as, you know, a very a place that was worthy of investment. And I had already written 2 books. I'd done a lot. And, you know, one of the things I'm kind of known for is my work in archives and taking an archival shard and trying to contextualizing it and being able to tell a story around it. But in this case, I was having a tough time, especially in terms of trying to get the voices of the community. And then one day it dawned on me. I remembered my tia Chayo sitting on her porch in Echo Park reading this newspaper called El Eco de Nayarit. And El Eco de Nayarit was from the state of Nayarit, and they would mail the newspaper to those living in the U.S. who subscribed to their newspaper. And so, you know, I ended up getting this run of the newspaper. A lot of the people I interviewed still had their back issues, especially the anniversary issue, which was more like a glossy magazine, and it was in color. But there's a library, you know, newspaper media library in Mexico City that has the complete run. And so I was able to get a 20-year run of it. And in it, they had this article called Rueda Ferris, so like Ferris wheel, like the ups and downs of life. And people would write in. It was almost like this, you know, newspaper, Facebook kind of combo where people would say like, hey, I'm living in LA, and if you come through town, I hope you look for me. I'm in LA and our kids just did their first communion. Here's their photo. And so it was how people, or, you know, and in Nayarit, people would write, so-and-so just got a postcard from her sister. You know, here's the postcard and here's the news that she reports from LA. And so there was this really interesting connection with Los Angeles, which is where the majority at this point of Nayaritas settled. Some settled in San Francisco, but the majority, you know, a couple in Texas, a couple in Arizona, but the majority in LA. And so we talk about transnational ties, and we think of these as being the kind of, you know, more elaborate or between corporations, companies, you know, the Mexican consulate. But here they were being able to do this through their letters, through their post in the newspaper. And so my grandmother actually advertised in that newspaper. I found very few advertisements, you know, really just a couple in LA community papers. But she did write and advertise in this paper. And because she also hosted the editor when he came through town, no surprise, there were a lot of favorable articles about her restaurant. She did pay for advertisement on the local Spanish radio station, KWKW, KW. And the person that whose show she would advertise on, Martin Becerra, he would then go be the MC at, you know, Spanish language variety shows like the $1 Million Theater downtown. And even though she didn't pay him, by then he was such a loyal customer that he'd say, well, okay, guys, night's over. And I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. And I'm going to go to the Nayarit restaurant. Those tablecloth staining ribs, those manche mantelas, I can't wait to get them. So she really understood, you know, how to get at her audience. And even though she didn't advertise in the LA Times, she was written up in the LA Times a couple of times. So, you know, word got out in the Spanish language press, in the English speaking press, in Mexico, in LA. She was covered.
Wow. Wow. She was good.
Yeah.
So our next question, Nate wants to know, where do people living outside the norm find safe spaces today?
That is a really great question. You know, I think that's such a challenging question to answer with everything that's going on. But, you know, we find that, well, one, there are still these kind of spaces, right? Restaurants and clubs and bars, you know, social spaces like running clubs, the ways that people find community through meetups, through Instagram, online communities, Latino cafes, Latino businesses. We have in Los Angeles, we're fortunate that we have Spanish language, or no, I'm sorry, press, Latino press. So within the LA Times, we have the column De Los that will feature businesses or social spaces, like I said, like running clubs. We have media like LA Taco that will report on things that will be unsafe for communities. So I'm going to think about a million other ways that this continues to happen. And this is the kind of thing that will launch a newsletter for me as I go on. But yes, I think there's a lot of ways to find out about these spaces. I had a PhD student, Karina Sanchez, who wrote this beautiful PhD dissertation that will become her first book on Latino-owned cafes. We have another graduate student on that really privileged Latino culture. And not just like traditional, but this kind of fusion culture, right? Like an horchata latte or, a Frida Kahlo inspired something. I have another grad student at USC, Brandon, who is doing a piece on music and the way that DJs and mariachis come into parties and really try to connect with the crowd. So, there's a lot of different ways that people are doing it. A lot of, activists as well, and places that are seeing when things aren't safe, like during COVID. For the first year of this book's release, I donated the proceeds to No Us Without You, because they saw that hospitality workers were out of a job because of COVID, and if they were immigrant, if they were undocumented, they were less likely to find jobs. Library programming for through this event I started a couple months ago. I've been donating proceeds of the sale of the book to the Altadena Public Library, because it was the building's intact post the Eaton fires, but a lot of the books were damaged. And the books were damaged if their patrons had them in their homes and the books burned down. But those public libraries are huge in being safe spaces for immigrant communities. I can speak best for our LA public libraries, but like our downtown library has an immigrant rights center or citizenship center where people can learn about these things, the programming. So I think it comes in very kind of official spaces as well as unofficial spaces. And luckily, because of social media, because of newsletters, because of all these different things, they're less difficult to find these days.
We just have, I know we're running a little short on time. It looks like we have two last ones if we can squeeze them in. And I'm going to skip to the bottom one first because I think it's related a little bit to what you just said. So someone asked, what is the state of the neighborhood? I'm presuming Echo Park. Are there still any places that cultivate this kind of cosmopolitanism?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing is that the neighborhood has changed a lot, and I write about it in the book. It has been gentrified. There are times that that both entrepreneurs and business owners, like my aunt for El Bate, have been priced out. And then there are residents that have been priced out, and there's been a lot written on that. There's other businesses that have moved in with that same kind of intent that Natalia Barraza did, breweries and pizza places and cafes. And the gentrification has gone on so long that now even they are priced out. So it does exist. The restaurant is now a club, which I write about in the book, called The Echo. And a lot of people have told me that it's meaningful for them to know the history of that club, finding out it had this history, because that club has also been a place that featured bands and offered opportunities for people to get together in ways they wouldn't otherwise. So, it's still there. I think people are still trying, but it is difficult, again, given housing, the price of housing in LA, the price of rents, structural components like that, people are attracted to the space because of this kind of cosmopolitanism. And then ironically, all of that also increases prices and drives people out. This is not unique to Echo Park. We see it in Boyle Heights. We see it in Brooklyn. We see it in all kinds of spaces, but it does at least give us a book like this, a story like this, understanding the history of each of these individual spaces, gives us a sense of what our responsibility is to one another.
Thank you. And finally, our last question. I'm writing a novella about my grandma's life and her migration story from Guadalajara to Tijuana, San Diego, and Los Angeles. I've done genealogy research and I want to interview people in her life. What are some other areas of research you recommend to paint a full picture of someone's life?
In the interest of time, I'll just say subscribe to my newsletter. You can go back to the past issues because this is one of the questions that I get a lot. I'm fortunate to have also interviewed people that are experts in oral history, like Virginia Espino, to talk about these issues and giving tips in terms of how you can bring your research to the interview so that people can comment on it, spark memories, and also realizing that oral interviews aren't the way that we're necessarily going to get the truth, but a truth. And I write about that in the book, all the conflicting stories I heard in the oral interviews and oral interviews that conflicted with the archives. But that's fine too, right? That's part of this, is understanding that people understand history from where they stand. So I'm so grateful for all your questions, Sue, for your amazing interview questions, and for leaving me with this quote about the community moves through lives in the ways that archives don't always capture. I had a great time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natalia. That was amazing. That was wonderful. And thanks to everybody for coming and for your wonderful questions.